Uh, I have a question about the equal and opposite arguments bit, because I admit that the claim that there are always equal and opposite arguments is very problematic, but what I think is probably not too problematic is this. To any claim P that you have an argument for, there are arguments against it that diminish your justification below the threshold of acceptability. So the suggestion would be that a few considerations that you haven't been able to take into account wouldn't be an argument for not P, but it would be an argument that you don't have sufficient evidence for P. And I think that's quite widespread, and maybe, at least insofar as the equal and opposite argument is doing a lot of work, maybe simply saying that you never have enough evidence to defeat the other side would be enough to put it back on the table.
It's an interesting suggestion. I mean, I think the immediate thing one wants to say about that is that that sort of, in a way, is contrary to the whole spirit of the relativist position, because the idea here is that you can make an equally good case for as against any principle which sort of gives you reason to support both sides, whereas this lack of justification would just sort of motivate a suspension of judgment or something. It wouldn't encourage the recognition of a validity on both sides. I think that would be a problem. I mean, it might work as an argument for a skeptic, but it doesn't sound like it's going to work for this sort of relativism that he's proposing. Shall we go down? Let's go clockwise for once. We've been going anti-clockwise.
Well, thank you very much. That's a very helpful paper for me. If you wouldn't mind just rehearsing the point about the relativity of meaning in contrast to relativity of truth.
Right.
I'm just wondering whether Protagoras is also asserting that the meaning of P it shifts or is different from the meaning for you in contrast for me, in which case we have a whole other set of interesting problems.
Yeah.
So if you wouldn't mind just rehearsing the relativity of meaning, that would be very helpful.
Thanks very much. That's a very good question, and I think it's getting at something I just didn't talk about. So what I'm interested in, of course, is that this is not just a doctrine that when you say, the wind's cold and I say it's not cold, it's in fact, what you say is in fact true for you, and what I say is in fact true for me. It's in addition that when you and I said those things, that was what we meant, that you meant that it's only true for you, and I meant that it's only true for me. And so that was the distinction I was interested in. But you're raising a different question, namely, roughly whether semantically Protagoras would analyze P is true for me as involving a predicate in which there's a common element to your statement that P is true for you, namely truth, and perhaps other commonalities, or whether it's sort of a unit, an indissoluble unit, which doesn't allow you to find any semantic common ground between us.
Yes, but
that would be one way of,
my concern is whether the P is held to be univocal across those two cases, such that if P turns into P, P turns into P prime,
right,
then they're just talking about different things,
right,
and there's no issue of contradiction.
Yes.
So P is not held to be univocal. That's my worry.
Yes.
Is that represented in Protagoras?
Good. Yeah. No. That's a further question besides the one I was mentioning. And yes, that did sound like what you were asking initially. So yeah, is the P even unequivocal, similar in meaning in the two cases? I think that the answer has to be yes for Protagoras, and that's why? Well, because otherwise he wouldn't need this machinery.
Yes, he also means that. Is that what you mean?
I think he has to think that P is univocal across...
It's univocal, yes.
the two cases, because otherwise he wouldn't need the other all this machinery in order to preclude contradiction, right? Contradiction would already be precluded because we don't mean the same thing when I say P and you say not P. So I think he has to think that P means the same for us both. That still leaves the question, though, that I was touching on, you know, whether true for me and true for you are to be understood as sort of indissoluble units that have no semantic commonalities, or rather as having lots of semantic commonalities and really differing just in their composition, right? So truth, you'd mean the same by true as I'd mean by true. It's just that you would always be saying true for me, and I'd be saying true for me. Thanks.
Okay. So if you were to accept some sort of Quinean-Kuhnian doctrine of radical meaning change across radical changes of theory or theoretical position, then would that nullify the dispute between Protagoras and Plato? Or how would it work out?
Would it not do what?
Would it sort of nullify the dispute between Protagoras and Plato, or
let me...
Who would win out in that?
Yeah.
Neither of them would entertain that doctrine. But
part of the purpose in the project was to sort of show how distinctive a position Protagoras is really. I mean, when you look at the motives behind it, for example, the Parmenidean paradox is crucial and so on. So it's not necessarily a position that has very close relationships with modern forms of relativism or things that are called relativism in contemporary debates. But as I was suggesting or hinting in the one of these objections to the opposite appearances, opposite arguments ground for his relativism, at the end, I think one of the problems that arises here is very much in this ballpark, namely that the sorts of empirically discovered alternative positions that tend to encourage something like a skepticism or a relativism or whatnot, versions of the opposite appearances, opposite arguments line of thought, tend indeed to turn out to involve a kind of conceptual incommensurability. And that's true not only in the anthropological cases or the across historical cases you might look at for morals, for example, but also of the more a priorist cases in logic and mathematics and so on, where, for example, logical constants just turn out to mean something different if you eliminate certain fundamental logical principles. So that was the line of thought, in effect, that this modern way of thinking about these issues is somewhat undermining of at least one of the legs on which his relativism stands. Yeah.
Thanks, Ron.
I was a bit puzzled by what you said about disagreement and contradiction.
Right.
So if I understood you right, Protagoras wanted to claim that no one ever disagreed with anyone else because otherwise, since they would both be right, a contradiction would be true, and
right.
He didn't want to accept that.
Right.
But I wondered what he would say about a case in which someone Graham Priest-like disagrees with himself, in effect.
Mm-hmm.
So says to himself, P and not P.
Mm-hmm.
One thing someone could say is that it's not really possible for someone to believe such a thing. But if you took that view, then your opponent would be inclined to come back and say, well, surely they can think that they believe such a thing. And even if you allow that, then since everyone is always right when they believe something, they do believe the contradiction, and then applying that again, you still end up with a true contradiction.
Right.
So what do you think Protagoras would have said to try to get out of this version of the worry about true contradictions?
Well, yeah, that's a topic very dear to my heart, and I've discussed this in other papers. broadly speaking, the way I see the Parmenidean heritage is that Parmenides does two things for the history of philosophy. He establishes the law of contradiction for the first time, has a clear statement of law of contradiction for the first time, and then he develops on that basis this paradox of not being. He does those two things in his poem, and I see Protagoras as taking over both of those insights. I didn't emphasize the law of contradiction part, that's because that's sort of more, less controversial or unexpected in a certain way. But one of the things I sort of think about this is that was, well, first of all, that was a real sort of achievement on Parmenides' part. It wasn't, as it were, just finding an implicit commitment, something we're already implicitly committed to anyway. The way Aristotle tried to argue in the Metaphysics, right? Aristotle tries to argue that you can't think anything at all without being committed to the law of contradiction itself and also conforming to it. And you know, a lot of the history of philosophy has just sort of bought that hook, line, and sinker. I think it doesn't work at all as an argument. And it dramatically understates or implies a dramatic understatement of Parmenides' achievement, because it looks then as though he's just bringing out to explicitness something that was always implicitly already believed by everybody. I think it was a real achievement. And so the idea is that this was a real achievement of Parmenides, and then Protagoras takes over both these achievements from Parmenides, both a commitment to the law of contradiction, or law of non-contradiction as we usually call it, and this concern with the Parmenidean paradox. And I think actually, you know, a lot of Greek philosophy after Parmenides does something rather similar. You know, it's wrestling with both of those assumptions that Parmenides had established.
So it's something that he's wrestling with, but you don't have a sort of suggestion about how he might have gotten out of the problem.
Well, he wouldn't see it as a problem. I mean, he's convinced that the law of contradiction cannot be violated.
Oh, so he would reject the claim that you can even think that you believe.
No. But he'd say you were doing something that was necessarily erroneous or incoherent or something.
Okay. So you're not always right when you.
I don't think he was a sort of proto-Aristotle, as far as I know. I mean, I don't see any evidence that he'd already developed the metaphysics gamma arguments or anything like that. But he was, I think, committed to this principle of non-contradiction. And, you know, Aristotle himself says it's not a principle you should expect to be able to prove because there's nothing more certain than it. So Aristotle doesn't think you can give a proof in anything like the traditional sense of a deduction from more fundamental premises or anything like that. So if insofar as Protagoras just accepts it, you know, one can imagine actually him giving a pretty good defense of that, what looks like maybe a dogmatic acceptance of the principle, but I don't think there's any evidence that he talked about these things, at least not in any fragments that exist.
It was absolutely fascinating. I was struck by one text that you cited that I didn't know, I think from Didymus, about clarity. And I want to ask you something about that.
Yeah.
So the way that seemed to go was, it is clear to me that I'm sitting. It's not clear to the people in the hotel now that I'm sitting.
Right.
Therefore, it is not clear that I'm sitting.
Yes,
so that
yes.
sounds almost like a kind of supervaluationism, where saying that something is clear tout court would mean, to pick up your thesis about it being a thesis of meaning, would mean clear to everyone. If one were to take that idea and move it over to Protagoras on being, the equivalent would be that being is being for everyone, and that would be an alternative reading of man as the measure. It would have an obvious problem, which is that if, in fact, there's equally good contrary appearances and counter arguments for everything, then we would end up denying that anything is. if being were being for mankind. But I was struck by the fact that this comment about clarity seems to push in that direction, and I'm wondering what it might reveal about Protagoras on what is or what is true.
Yeah. I've also puzzled about the apparent implication that you were picking up on. It does sound, the way the passage reads, as though that's the intended meaning. It's unclear on both sides because of the perceptual unavailability on the one side, right? I mean, that seems to be the gist. So to quote it again, this is Didymus speaking. Protagoras says that being for things that are consists in their being perceived. He says, and then quotes, it's clear to you as being present that I'm sitting. To one who is not present, however, it is not clear that I'm sitting. Therefore, it's unclear whether I'm sitting or not sitting. Now, you might read it that way, or you might read it making it a little less puzzling, perhaps, as really the last sentence is really just referring to the one of the two sides. That's to say, it's unclear whether I'm sitting or not sitting for the people who don't have the perceptual access only. And I'm inclined to read it that way, so it's more restricted. The other position would be just intrinsically rather peculiar, right? I mean, the suggestion that if I do have perceptual access, the mere fact that you don't makes my cognition unclear. It's a difficult position to...
Still clear to me, but unclear.
Sorry? Is that a joke or are you? Okay. No, so that's the main reason why I prefer this alternative reading, that it's easier to see why one would say that.
So is there time for a question, or should I?
I have two people in the room to ask questions, so if you want to...
Pass it on and ask Michael later.
Okay, thank you.
Then I'll try to be clear. Because I have a follow-up, I was also wondering about this. Just a brief comment. I think it's probably not a coincidence that he does not say anthropon met estin. There's no estin. He's dropping it. But that would be about this one sentence, and that's not... I was more struck by the second one. Why not say that, so do you think this is an option? The Didymus could also be read as just a denial of bivalence. So he's saying, it is clear to me that you are sitting. I'm here, you are here, it's clear to you. And it's not clear to Angela Merkel whether I'm sitting. She couldn't care less. It's not in her evidential record. Therefore, what he's denying is this does not entail that it's either clear that someone is sitting or not sitting, because no one has evidence for that. There's evidence for someone sitting for us, and no such evidence for Angela Merkel, which does not mean that we thereby have evidence for accepting the statement that someone is either sitting or not sitting. So he would be making this would just be, and if this is the correct interpretation of the Didymus, then he might not even be a relativist, but just an anti-realist. And all of this would be about evidence. He wouldn't be making a point about propositions or facts, etc. The entire story would be a certain anti-realism relating truth to evidence. Do you think this could be coherently cashed out? And then Plato is just completely getting him wrong. So he's ascribing claims to Protagoras that he needn't make in order to say all the exciting things that he wants to say. But the exciting thing about it is that he would be a Dametian anti-realist, maybe global.
Yeah, if I heard your suggestion rightly, I think it's an interesting, really variation on the theme I was just playing. I mean, it's well. I take it. If I heard rightly, the idea would be sort of it would be in effect saying what I was saying, but then saying, so you can infer from that if you mean by delos, delos for everybody, then it's not delos for everybody, because it's not delos for these people in particular, right? So it would be a third reading of that last sentence, that I think is actually quite plausible, but it would be, as it were, substantively the same as the reading I was suggesting. He wouldn't be denying that there was any deilotes for the people who were having the perceiving. It's just that deilotes, in the sense of deilos for everybody, would be absent, because there are some people who are not having the perceiving. So I think substantively it would amount to the same position, probably. And that is the reading I'm attracted to. Again, partly just for these substantive reasons, that it's difficult to see why you would make the other claim.
All the books involve is that if someone says it's true for, like on that reading, there's nothing problematic about it, because he would have dropped the idea of facts in the first place. So the idea that there should be facts, and that there might be some facts for which no one could have any evidence, that idea is out of the picture. Yeah. And if that idea is out of the picture, then some of the things that you want to say is it true for do not sound paradoxical. You wouldn't be moved by the same considerations when trying to go against it.
Right.
And Plato would then be assuming all sorts of things that come in that Protagoras might even have very strong arguments against in the first place.
Yeah, well, I think that's almost certainly the case on any score. But I also found your first remark very interesting. Yeah, the esti doesn't appear in that key doctrine. I'm sure you're right, because you know, that would be at least a sort of invitation to a charge that he's contradicting himself. And as the rest of the doctrine proceeds, you know, man, the measure of all things, and so that's the relativistic sense of being or truth gestured towards. So why slip in the verb est in without qualification and invite the charge that you're contradicting yourself? I think it's a very plausible suggestion.
Thank you, Michael, so much for such a stimulating paper.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your questions.